May 27, 1943. The B-24 Liberator, known as Green Hornet, cut through the empty blue of the Pacific Ocean, more than 850 miles south of Oahu, far beyond any visible land. What should have been a routine search mission was already stacked against the men aboard. The aircraft had a reputation among pilots as unreliable, a mechanical lemon, but in wartime options were limited and risks were accepted without debate. Inside the bomber was Louis Zamperini, 26 years old, once celebrated on the world stage as an Olympic runner, now serving as a bombardier in the United States Air Force's 372nd Bomb Squadron. Just 7 years earlier, Zamperini had raced before Adolf Hitler in Berlin. Now there were no crowds, no finish lines, only ocean in every direction. Without warning, the Green Hornet began to fail. Engines lost power. Controls became unresponsive. There was no enemy fire, no heroic last maneuver, only the sickening realization that the aircraft could not stay aloft. Moments later, the bomber slammed into the water with devastating force. Metal tore apart, fuel ignited. The Pacific swallowed the wreckage almost instantly. Of the 11 men on board, 8 were killed in the crash. In the wreckage and burning fuel, survival came down to instinct and seconds. Zamperini was thrown clear, injured but conscious. Nearby, pilot Russell Allen Phillips fought his way to the surface. Tail gunner Francis McNamara also emerged alive. They were the only ones. The 3 survivors managed to pull themselves onto small life rafts, drifting amid debris and oil. What little they had, meager rations, a few tools, was all that stood between them and the ocean. No land, no radio, no certainty that anyone even knew where they had gone down. As the sun lowered over the Pacific, the scale of their situation became undeniable. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was the beginning of a fight for survival that would test the limits of the human body and spirit. And it had only just begun. Morning came quietly. The wreckage from the Green Hornet had vanished beneath the Pacific, leaving 3 men on 2 small life rafts, surrounded by nothing but open water. No smoke on the horizon, no sound of engines. The silence was worse than the crash itself. It confirmed what they already feared. No one was coming soon. They took stock of what they had. The supplies were pitiful, a few cans of water, several pieces of chocolate, some flares, and basic survival tools salvaged from the wreck. The math was terrifying. Even with strict rationing, the food and water might last days, not weeks. Zamperini and Phillips immediately agreed on discipline. Eat little, drink less, survive as long as possible. The ocean, however, did not wait. Sharks appeared early. Dark shapes circled beneath the rafts, bumping them without warning. Francis McNamara used an oar to beat them back, sometimes striking the water blindly, knowing that one mistake could flip the raft or pull a man under. Sleep became nearly impossible. Every movement of water felt like an attack. The psychological strain began almost immediately. McNamara blamed himself for the crash, replaying decisions he could not undo. His fear was constant and visible. Zamperini and Phillips tried to maintain order, counting hours, watching the sun, forcing routine where none naturally existed. Zamperini's Olympic training, once used to endure pain on a track, now surfaced as mental control: focus, conserve, endure. But discipline cracked under hunger. Within days, McNamara consumed the emergency chocolate rations, unable to stop himself. The short burst of energy was gone almost as quickly as it came.
Zamperini was furious, not because the food was gone, but because its loss made survival even more uncertain. Yet anger solved nothing. The ocean did not care about blame. At one point, an aircraft appeared in the distance. The men waved, shouted, fired flares, then watched helplessly as it disappeared. Hope rose and died in minutes. As the days stretched on, one truth became unavoidable. This was no short ordeal. The Pacific had claimed them, and it was not finished yet. Days blurred into one another as the last of the rations disappeared. From that point on, survival depended entirely on what the Pacific chose to give or take away. Hunger became constant, gnawing and sharp, while thirst burned even worse. When rain fell, Zamperini and Phillips tilted their heads and containers upward, collecting every drop. When it didn't, they endured. They learned to hunt. Seabirds, mostly albatrosses, occasionally landed on the rafts, exhausted from flight. The men caught them with bare hands, ate the meat raw, and saved the organs and bones to use as bait. Fish followed. Some were pulled in with makeshift hooks, others by hand, their bodies thrashing violently as sharks closed in. Often the men were fighting the sharks and the fish at the same time. The ocean fed them, but only after demanding courage in return. The environment showed no mercy. A violent storm slammed into the rafts, waves towering overhead, nearly capsizing them. At times the men were thrown apart, each believing the others lost. When the storm passed, they were still alive, but weaker, salt-soaked, and shaken. Sun blistered their skin during the day, cold seeped into their bones at night. Sleep came in fragments. Then the war found them again, and Japanese aircraft appeared overhead and opened fire. Bullets tore through the rafts, sending air and water hissing out. The men dove flat, frantically plugging holes and bailing water, expecting death at any second. Miraculously, none were hit. The plane eventually disappeared, leaving them wounded but alive, floating targets in the middle of enemy-controlled waters. Physically, they were deteriorating fast. Weight dropped, muscles wasted, salt sores cracked open. Hunger distorted their thoughts. McNamara weakened visibly, his strength fading day by day. Zamperini, drawing on years of athletic endurance, forced himself to stay alert, to keep moving, to keep fighting. But a chilling realization settled in. Even if they survived the ocean, they were drifting toward Japanese-held territory. The sea might not be the end of their suffering. It might only be the beginning. By the fourth week adrift, time had lost its structure. Days were measured not by dates, but by pain, hunger, and the position of the sun. The men's bodies were skeletal now, skin burned black by the sun and split open by salt sores. Movement required effort. Thought itself felt heavy. Francis McNamara was failing. His strength had ebbed away until he could barely lift his arms. He struggled to swallow what little food they caught. His speech became faint, sometimes incoherent. Zamperini and Phillips watched him closely, knowing there was nothing they could do except keep him alive for one more hour, then one more. Survival had become a series of small, desperate postponements. On the 33rd day, McNamara died quietly. There was no final speech, no dramatic moment, just stillness. Zamperini and Phillips sat with his body in silence, the reality settling in slowly. Of the 11 men who had taken off in the Green Hornet, only 2 were left. They wrapped McNamara's body and lowered it into the Pacific. It was a brief, restrained farewell. There were no tears left to spare. Grief had to be contained, controlled, and set aside because survival demanded attention. The ocean closed over him, erasing all trace. Now alone together, Zamperini and Phillips faced the sea with even fewer defenses. Every task was harder. Every night felt longer. Sharks continued to circle, relentless and patient. Hunger hollowed them out. Their bodies consumed themselves to stay alive. And yet they drifted on. In the final stretch of the 47-day ordeal, something changed. The water shifted in color. Birds appeared more frequently. Then, faint and unreal at first, land emerged on the horizon. After weeks of endless blue, the sight was almost overwhelming. They did not know where they were, only that the drift was ending. Whether it meant salvation or something worse, neither man could tell. After 47 days adrift, Louis Zamperini and Russell Allen Phillips finally saw land. Their bodies, emaciated and salt-crusted, could barely move as they dragged themselves onto the shore. For a fleeting moment, hope surged. Solid ground, the promise of water, the chance to eat without rationing. Yet the relief was little short-lived. They had landed on the Marshall Islands, territories firmly controlled by the Japanese military, and the shadow of war had not lifted with their arrival. Almost immediately they were spotted. Islanders approached first, their expressions unreadable. Zamperini and Phillips, barely able to stand, offered weak signs of surrender. Within minutes, Japanese naval forces arrived. The men were surrounded, disarmed, and quickly identified as enemy airmen. Their long ordeal in the Pacific had ended, but survival had only entered a new, far more dangerous phase. Zamperini's body was battered from nearly 7 weeks at sea, skin burned and peeling, muscles wasted, eyes sunken from lack of sleep and nourishment. Phillips fared no better. Even in this weakened state, Zamperini refused to collapse entirely. He maintained a flicker of resolve, drawing on the same mental toughness that had carried him through races at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Yet now he faced a foe that could not be outrun or outlasted, the cruelty of the enemy in uniform. The prisoners were immediately taken into custody, beginning a period of captivity that would last more than 2 years. They were transported first to Kwajalein Atoll, then through a series of Japanese POW camps, each with its own rules, guards, and horrors. Zamperini's status as a famous Olympian was marked for particular attention, especially from guards who resented or envied his reputation. One, Mutsuhiro the Bird, was a constant source of terror, his sadistic punishments designed to break both body and spirit. What had been a battle with the relentless Pacific was now a confrontation with human cruelty. The ocean had tested endurance, but imprisonment would test the very limits of mental and emotional survival. Zamperini and Phillips would quickly learn that their ordeal was far from over, and that survival required far more than strength and skill. It required patience, resilience, and eventually the will to forgive.
August 1945 arrived, and with it the end of World War II. For Louis Zamperini, liberation came at last, but freedom was far from the relief he had imagined. Years of captivity had left his body frail, muscles wasted, skin scarred, eyes hollow, and his mind haunted by memories of starvation, shark attacks, storms, and most vividly, the relentless brutality of his captor, Mutsuhiro the Bird Watanabe. The war was over, but the war inside him had only just begun. Returning to the United States, Zamperini faced a different battlefield, home. Post-traumatic stress shadowed every step. Nightmares tormented his sleep. Alcohol became a temporary refuge from memory. Ordinary life, family, work, even running felt impossibly distant. He wrestled with anger and resentment, especially toward those who had inflicted unimaginable cruelty during his imprisonment. For a time, it seemed the Pacific and the POW camps had won, leaving him adrift in a new, invisible ocean of psychological torment. Yet a transformation was on the horizon. In the early 1950s, Zamperini encountered Christian faith and through it began a path of forgiveness.
Forgiving Watanabe and those who had tormented him became central to his recovery. The same mental toughness that had carried him through 47 days at sea now allowed him to confront inner demons. He redirected his energy toward others, dedicating himself from 1952 onward to helping at-risk youth and speaking to communities about resilience, forgiveness, and the strength of the human spirit. Zamperini's story would reach audiences far beyond his lifetime. He became the subject of multiple biographical films, including Unbroken, 2014, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, 2018, and Captured by Grace, 2015, each portraying his journey from Olympic athlete to wartime survivor to spiritual leader. Yet beyond the silver screen, his legacy endured in the countless lives he touched, a testament to the capacity of a human being to overcome suffering and choose compassion over revenge. From the boy in Torrance, California, bullied for his Italian roots, to the Olympic runner who caught Hitler's attention, to the airman who survived the Pacific, to the POW who endured unimaginable torment, and finally, to the evangelist who forgave his captors, the arc of Louis Zamperini's life is one of endurance, courage, and redemption. In every chapter, the same truth emerges. The human spirit, when tested to its limits, can endure, adapt, and ultimately inspire generations to come.